A night to remember. The biting autumn wind swept through the quiet suburban streets, rustling the leaves and casting an uneasy stillness over the neighborhood. In the darkness, the night seemed to hold its breath, awaiting an inevitable disruption. Within the confines of her modest sit-in, Mary Evans adjusted her scarf, tugging it snugly around her neck as she squinted against the blur of headlights gliding along the road. Mary was in her late 70s, and despite her age, she navigated the familiar streets of her neighborhood with ease. She lived alone now, her late husband a warm memory, and her days were filled with caring for her small garden and visiting her friends. This evening, she had attended her weekly book club and was heading back home when the unwelcome flash of red and blue lights illuminated her rearview mirror. With a sinking feeling, she pulled her car over to the side of the road. She hadn't been speeding, and everything with her car seemed to be in working order, so the sudden appearance of the police was unexpected. Her hands gripped the steering wheel as she watched the officers approach her vehicle, their expressions unreadable but their stances undeniably rigid. License and registration. One of the officers barked as he approached her open window, the cold command startling her. Mary, slightly flustered, fumbled with her purse, her trembling fingers searching for her documents. She handed them over with a faint smile, hoping to diffuse the tension she felt simmering in the air. "Is something wrong, officer?" she asked, her voice calm but edged with confusion. The officer's gaze was cold and dismissive. He didn't answer her question, instead turning to his partner with a look that Mary couldn't quite decipher. She heard one of them mutter something under his breath, and her pulse quickened. They seemed to linger too long, eyeing her vehicle as though they were searching for an excuse, any reason to escalate the situation. A third police car pulled up, and another officer exited, his hand hovering close to his holstered gun. The unease inside Mary blossomed into a quiet panic, but she remained still, her gaze fixed ahead as her mind raced. These men looked at her like she was a suspect, someone dangerous, not the elderly woman she knew herself to be. "Step out of the vehicle, ma'am," the first officer commanded, his tone sharp and unyielding. Mary blinked, her confusion evident. She knew she had done nothing wrong, and her bewilderment must have shown on her face, but the officers seemed unmoved. "Please, I don't understand," she started, her voice wavering slightly. "Why do you want me to get out of the car?" "Step out of the vehicle," the officer repeated, louder this time, his patience thinning with every second. His partner moved closer, as if anticipating resistance. Mary's pulse raced as she carefully unbuckled her seatbelt, her hands unsteady as she pushed open the car door and stepped out onto the pavement. She tried to keep her composure, though her heart pounded with a mixture of fear and indignation. She had raised a son to be respectful, to always honor the law, yet here she was, feeling cornered and disrespected without any clear cause. One of the officers motioned for her to stand beside the hood of her car, and Mary complied, her posture tense and uncertain. As she turned to face them, one of the officers barked, "Keep your hands where we can see them." Mary's hands shook slightly as she held them up, a cold breeze nipping at her face. Her mind drifted to her son, Aaron, the newly appointed police commissioner of the city, a man who had dedicated his life to upholding justice and fairness. Her pride in him was immense, but tonight it only made her feel the stark contrast between what he believed in and the treatment she was receiving. As the officers continued their inspection, one of them spoke into his radio, muttering coded words that Mary couldn't understand. She felt a surge of indignation rising within her. It was as though they were treating her like a common criminal, and it was more than her pride could bear. "Officers, please," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "Can you at least explain what's happening? I've done nothing wrong." The officer merely sneered, his eyes cold and calculating. "We're following protocol. Stand still and keep quiet." Mary's hands balled into fists as she bit her tongue, determined not to let her anger get the best of her. But her patience was wearing thin, and she felt a simmering resentment building within her. She looked away, her gaze drifting to her phone. which she had left on the passenger seat of her car. If only she could call Aaron. Then, as though her silent wish had been heard, one of the officers finally moved away from her car, turning his back to confer with his partners. Seizing her chance, Mary took a deep breath and subtly reached toward her open car door. With a quick, practiced motion, she grabbed her phone and hit the speed dial for her son. It rang once, then twice, before she heard his familiar voice. "Mom." Aaron's voice was warm and familiar, filled with the usual concern that marked their relationship, but she could barely hear it over the nervous pounding of her heart. "Aaron, I'm pulled over, and they're treating me like a criminal," she whispered, her voice strained. "I don't know what I did, but it feels wrong." On the other end, Aaron's tone changed, his voice hardening with a quiet intensity. "Stay calm, Mom. I'm on my way." As she slipped her phone back into the car, she felt a small spark of hope. If anyone could handle this situation, it was her son. Commissioner Aaron Evans was known for his unwavering commitment to justice and his dedication to treating every citizen with respect, regardless of their background. But as the minutes passed, the officers' attitudes only seemed to grow more hostile, their questions more invasive, their suspicion more apparent. One of the officers approached her again, his eyes flashing with an anger that seemed unprovoked. "I said, keep your hands where I can see them," he snapped, his hand hovering dangerously close to his gun. Mary's heart skipped a beat, her calm beginning to crack under the weight of the escalating tension. She took a shaky breath, her mind racing as she tried to understand what had gone so wrong. And just as she felt the icy grip of fear settle over her, a pair of headlights appeared in the distance, growing larger as they approached. Aaron's car came to a stop just behind the police vehicles, and the sight of her son stepping out filled Mary with a rush of relief. His tall frame and confident stride exuded a quiet authority that was impossible to ignore. Clad in his formal coat, his face was stern, and his eyes were sharp with a silent fury that made the officers pause. The commanding officer turned, his expression faltering as he met Aaron's gaze. "And who might you be?" he asked, his tone oozing with disdain. "I'm Commissioner Evans," Aaron replied, his voice calm but firm, each word carrying the weight of his position. "And I'd like to know what's going on here." The officer's face paled, his previous bravado fading as he took in the full weight of Aaron's words. His eyes flickered between Aaron and Mary, as if trying to piece together what he had missed. But the realization of his misstep was beginning to dawn on him. I didn't realize," the officer stammered. But Aaron silenced him with a cold glare. "You didn't realize that treating an elderly woman with disrespect is wrong." Aaron's voice was quiet but razor-sharp, each word cutting through the air with the weight of unspoken authority. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, their previous arrogance dissolving into discomfort. Aaron turned to his mother, his gaze softening as he placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Are you all right, Mom?" he asked gently. Mary nodded, though her heart was still pounding. "I'm fine now, Aaron." Without another word, Aaron turned back to the officers, his calm veneer barely concealing the storm brewing beneath. "This," he said, his voice steady but laced with barely restrained fury, "is not how we treat people in this city." The officers shifted uneasily, the weight of their actions pressing down on them with a new intensity. In that moment, they realized that they hadn't just overstepped a line. They had trampled over a fundamental principle of justice and decency, and the consequences were about to unfold in ways they hadn't anticipated. A reckoning unfolds. As Aaron Evans held his mother's hand, a wave of emotions crashed over him. Anger, disappointment, and an unyielding resolve to confront this injustice head-on. The officers, who just moments before had exuded authority and confidence, now stood shifting awkwardly under his piercing gaze. In the dim light of the street, Aaron's imposing figure and commanding presence made it clear that the tables had turned. Aaron's voice was calm but resolute. "I want an explanation for this," he demanded, his tone carrying an air of undeniable authority. What justifies pulling over and intimidating an elderly woman with no probable cause? The lead officer swallowed hard, glancing at his partners, who looked equally uneasy. His voice, once forceful, was now almost meek. "Sir, we were just following protocol." She was acting suspiciously. Suspiciously. Erin's voice dripped with incredulity. Because she was driving home from her book club, or because you saw her alone, vulnerable, and assumed she would be an easy target. The officers had no response, their silence as damning as any confession. Erin could feel his anger bubbling beneath the surface, and he fought to keep it in check. It wasn't just about his mother. It was about the countless others who suffered quietly, invisible, and unheard. People who didn't have a police commissioner to stand up for them. This was a symptom of a much larger disease, one that he had spent his entire career trying to root out, only to be reminded tonight of how deeply it still ran. "Did you even check her ID before demanding she get out of the car?" He pressed, his tone sharper now. The officer flinched slightly, realizing that this line of questioning would only end badly for him. One of the junior officers cleared his throat nervously. We followed procedure, Commissioner." "Procedure?" Erin echoed, his voice turning cold. "If this is your idea of procedure, then it's a procedure that needs serious reevaluation. My mother was not only complying with your demands, but treated with utter disrespect. And if I hadn't arrived, who knows how far this would have escalated." Mary looked up at her son, pride and concern mingling in her gaze. She had raised him to stand for justice, to be a voice for those who were often silenced or ignored. And in that moment, watching him confront these officers with the same calm but unwavering resolve that had driven him his entire life, she knew she had succeeded. "I want your badge numbers," Erin stated, his tone brokering no room for argument. The officers hesitated, but Erin's steely gaze prompted them to comply, each of them reluctantly reciting their numbers. He entered them into his phone, a silent promise to himself that this would not end here. They could try to sweep this under the rug, but Erin would ensure that their behavior was scrutinized under the brightest spotlight. The tension between Erin and the officers was palpable, hanging thickly in the air. Finally, Erin took a step back, releasing a slow breath. His mother reached out and gently touched his arm, grounding him. "Erin, I think that's enough," she whispered, her voice soft but steady. He glanced at her, his anger tempered by her calm. She had always been the one to soothe him, to remind him that patience and understanding could sometimes accomplish what anger could not. Taking her cue, he turned back to the officers, his expression unyielding. "This ends here," he said, his voice low but firm. "I expect you to file a report detailing every part of this incident by tomorrow morning. I will be reviewing it personally." "Understood." The officers nodded, their faces pale with apprehension. Erin held their gaze for a moment longer, letting the gravity of his words settle over them before he turned back to his mother. He gently placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, guiding her back toward her car. Once she was safely inside, Erin glanced one last time at the officers before getting into his own car. As he sat behind the wheel, he took a moment to calm himself, to let the simmering anger in his chest subside. He knew this was just the beginning. What happened tonight was a symptom of a system that was broken, and while he could confront these officers here and now, true change would require much more. As he drove his mother home, the car was filled with a tense silence. Mary, ever observant, broke it first. "Thank you, Erin, for standing up for me," she said quietly, a mixture of pride and worry in her voice. Erin's expression softened as he looked at her. "I'm sorry you had to go through that, Mom. It shouldn't have happened." She placed a hand on his arm, her touch warm and reassuring. "It's all right. I'm just grateful you were there." Erin nodded, but he couldn't shake the gnawing feeling in his gut. His mother had been lucky. He had been close by, able to intervene before things got worse. But how many others weren't so fortunate? How many times had incidents like this gone unchecked, dismissed as routine? As they pulled up to her house, he escorted her inside, walking her to the cozy living room where she spent most of her evenings. The familiar scent of lavender and fresh linens filled the air, and for a moment, the comforting atmosphere seemed to ease his mind. Mary settled into her armchair, and Aaron sat across from her, his face contemplative. He needed to address this, to make sure this wasn't just another incident that was forgotten by the next morning. His position gave him power, a responsibility to act. He knew that the road ahead would be tough, but his mother's quiet strength reminded him why he had taken on this role in the first place. After a moment of silence, Mary spoke again, her voice soft but thoughtful. "Aaron, this isn't just about tonight, is it?" He looked at her, surprised at her insight. "No, Mom, it's not. This is about all the people who face this kind of treatment every day and don't have someone to fight for them. I'm going to make sure this stops." Mary reached out, taking his hand in hers. "Then go do it. You have the power to make a difference, Aaron. I raised you to be a fighter, but also to be fair. Go show them what that means." With her words ringing in his ears, Aaron rose, giving her hand a gentle squeeze before making his way back to his car. His mind raced with thoughts of the action he needed to take. The next few days would be critical, and he knew he couldn't afford to let this opportunity slip by. The following morning, Aaron was at his desk before dawn, poring over case files, reports, and complaints that had slipped through the cracks. As police commissioner, he was well aware of the complaints that piled up, of the cases that seemed to go nowhere. But today, he was determined to go through each one with a fine-toothed comb. He called in his top advisors and supervisors, demanding a full briefing on the complaint process and how they could implement changes to ensure incidents like his mother's would not be ignored. As the sun rose higher, casting a golden glow over the cityscape, Aaron's resolve only grew. He spent the entire morning drafting a new set of protocols, insisting that any interaction involving excessive use of force or unwarranted stops would be reviewed personally by him. He wanted a more transparent complaint process, one that would allow citizens to speak out without fear of retribution. By the afternoon, word of his efforts had started to spread through the department, and a mix of reactions filtered in. Some officers appreciated his dedication to accountability, while others muttered resentfully under their breath, dismissing his actions as unnecessary oversight. As the day wore on, Aaron found himself in a tense meeting with the precinct captains. The room was filled with a charged atmosphere as the captains exchanged wary glances. Aaron could sense the resistance from a few of them, officers who had been in the force for decades and were set in their ways. One of the senior captains, a man named Matthews, cleared his throat, his tone a mixture of caution and defensiveness. "Commissioner Evans, with all due respect, these new protocols you're suggesting, do you really believe they're necessary? This department has operated just fine for years without them." Aaron's gaze was unwavering as he met Matthew's eyes. "Necessary?" he echoed, his tone calm but resolute. "Absolutely. Last night, my mother was treated like a criminal without any cause, and if that can happen to her, it can happen to anyone. These protocols aren't about punishing officers. They're about protecting our citizens and rebuilding the trust we've lost." Matthews shifted uncomfortably, but Aaron pressed on, his gaze sweeping across the room. "We're not here to serve ourselves. We're here to serve the people. And if that means we need to change, to hold ourselves to a higher standard, then that's exactly what we're going to do." The room fell into a heavy silence as Aaron's words sank in, the weight of his determination resonating with everyone present. Some of the captains nodded subtly, while others avoided his gaze, but Aaron didn't need their approval. He was prepared to make these changes, with or without their support. As the meeting concluded, Aaron returned to his office, his heart pounding with a mixture of frustration and resolve. He glanced at his mother's photo on his desk, a small framed picture from his college graduation. Her smile was warm and proud, a constant reminder of why he had chosen this path. In that moment, he knew that he couldn't rest until real change was made, until every officer under his command understood the importance of their duty to protect and serve. And for the first time in his career, he felt a sense of clarity, a purpose that transcended the badge he wore. This was only the beginning. The battle for reform begins. Aaron Evans sat alone in his dimly lit office as evening settled over the city. The day had been filled with a series of grueling meetings and uncomfortable confrontations, but as he stared at his desk, cluttered with reports and complaints, he knew the real work was just beginning. His mother's incident had ignited a spark within him, a determination to confront the unchecked power that some of his officers seemed to wield, a power that seemed too often to ignore justice and common decency. He glanced at the time and felt a familiar pang of exhaustion tugging at him. But this battle was worth every sleepless night, every strained moment. He had inherited a system plagued by ingrained prejudice and unspoken biases, and it was going to take more than words to tear it down. As the clock ticked past 7, the door to his office creaked open, and his deputy commissioner, Rachel Lynn, stepped inside. Rachel had been his right hand since he'd first taken office, a relentless advocate for community justice, and one of the few officers he could trust implicitly. Her sharp eyes scanned the room, taking in Aaron's weary posture and the intensity in his expression. "Long day?" she asked, a hint of empathy in her tone as she took a seat across from him. "You could say that," Aaron replied with a tired smile. "But it's nothing compared to what we're about to face." Rachel nodded, folding her arms as she studied him. "I've been hearing whispers around the precinct. Some officers aren't thrilled about the changes you're pushing through." Aaron's jaw tightened slightly, his mind drifting back to the precinct captains who had resisted his proposed reforms. "I know, but I didn't take this job to win a popularity contest. These changes are necessary, Rachel. If last night taught me anything, it's that we can't let this culture of intimidation and prejudice continue." Rachel leaned forward, her voice low but steady. "Then let's get to work. I've put together a list of complaints and cases involving excessive force and unwarranted stops from the last year. Some of them have just been collecting dust in our archives. Maybe now's the time to give them a closer look." Aaron took the stack of files she handed him, his eyes scanning the names and details. Each case told a story of injustice, a moment when someone's life had been upended or their dignity stripped away. A college student arrested for resisting despite complying with every command, an elderly man injured during an unnecessary stop, a young mother detained in front of her children. All reminders that his mother's experience was far from unique. As he flipped through the pages, a determination settled over him. "We'll reopen these cases, starting tomorrow," he said firmly. "I want a task force assigned to review every single one. We're going to make it clear that this department will not tolerate abuse of power." Rachel smiled faintly, the admiration in her gaze unmistakable. "I'll start assembling the task force. But you know this isn't going to be easy. You'll have officers questioning your loyalty, the unions pushing back, and even some of our allies may think you're moving too fast." Aaron met her gaze with unwavering resolve. "I don't care how much pushback we get. This isn't just about me or this department. It's about the people we serve. If we don't change, we're failing them." Rachel nodded, a glint of determination in her eyes. "All right. Then let's get ready for war." Over the next few weeks, Aaron and Rachel launched a full-scale review of the department's policies, analyzing every step of the complaint process, every protocol on traffic stops, and every training manual that hadn't been updated in years. They gathered a team of community representatives, legal experts, and civil rights advocates to help shape the new policies they wanted to implement. Word of the sweeping reforms quickly spread through the precincts, and the response was as divided as Aaron had expected. Younger officers, eager for change and inspired by the mission, rallied behind him. They appreciated his dedication to accountability and saw his efforts as a way to restore the community's trust in the police force. But others, officers who had been around for decades and had grown accustomed to the old ways, weren't as accepting. The whispers of discontent grew louder with each passing day. At the start of each shift, Aaron could feel the tension in the air, a palpable resistance among the ranks. Some officers blatantly ignored him, their body language and hushed conversations a clear show of defiance. One afternoon, Aaron was in a meeting with Rachel and the task force when an officer barged in, his expression angry and flushed. "Commissioner, I need a word," the officer, Lieutenant Grant, said, barely disguising the bitterness in his tone. Rachel tensed, glancing at Aaron, but he held up a hand to indicate that it was fine. "What's on your mind, Lieutenant?" Grant folded his arms, his gaze hard as he addressed Aaron. "With all due respect, Commissioner, these reforms are making it impossible to do our jobs. You're making us look like criminals, scrutinizing our every move." Aaron met Grant's stare calmly, refusing to be intimidated. "These reforms are about accountability, Lieutenant. They're meant to ensure that we're treating the public with respect, not as suspects." Grant scoffed, his voice dripping with contempt. "Respect? We're dealing with criminals every day. You think they care about respect? All these changes are going to do is tie our hands and make us vulnerable." Aaron leaned forward, his gaze steady. "Lieutenant, I understand that this job is dangerous. But if we sacrifice our integrity, we lose the trust of the people we're supposed to protect. We can't allow fear or prejudice to cloud our judgment. We're here to serve the community, not rule over it." Grant's face twisted with anger, his fists clenching at his sides. "You're making a mistake, Commissioner. These changes will weaken this department. Mark my words." Aaron watched as Grant turned on his heel and stormed out, his heavy footsteps echoing down the hallway. He let out a slow breath, aware that this confrontation was only a glimpse of the battles that lay ahead. Rachel glanced at him, her expression a mix of concern and admiration. "He's not the only one who feels that way," she said quietly. "I know," Aaron replied, his voice calm but determined. "But we're not backing down. We can't." In the weeks that followed, Aaron found himself facing constant scrutiny, not only from his own department, but from the police union, local politicians, and even members of the press. His reforms were met with public praise and private backlash, and he soon became a divisive figure in the city. To some, he was a hero, a leader finally standing up to the deep-seated issues within law enforcement. To others, he was a traitor, a man who was betraying his own to appease the demands of a vocal minority. One evening, as he was reviewing a list of new community engagement initiatives, his phone buzzed with a call from City Hall. It was Mayor Walsh, a staunch ally and an old friend who had supported his appointment as commissioner. "Evening, Mayor," Aaron greeted him, his tone warm despite the fatigue he felt. "Evening, Aaron. I just wanted to check in. There's been a lot of chatter lately. How are you holding up?" Aaron leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "It's been a rough few weeks, to be honest, but we're making progress. Rachel and I have put together a solid task force, and the community seems to be behind us." Mayor Walsh sighed, his tone shifting to a more cautious note. "I'm glad to hear it, but you should know that some of the council members are concerned. They're getting pressure from the union and certain donors who don't appreciate the changes you're implementing. They're worried it could impact the city's reputation, or even lead to a spike in resignations." Aaron's jaw tightened as he listened. He understood the political ramifications, but the frustration simmered within him. "With all due respect, Mayor, we're not here to cater to those who resist progress. This city deserves a police force it can trust, and if that means losing a few officers who can't meet that standard, so be it." There was a pause on the other end, and when the mayor spoke again, his tone was careful. "I understand, Aaron, and I'm behind you. But you're walking a tightrope here. I just need to make sure we're aligned. Let's keep pushing forward, but be mindful of the balance we need to maintain. I appreciate your support, Mayor. I'll do my best to keep that balance, but I won't compromise on integrity." After hanging up, Aaron took a deep breath, staring out his window at the city skyline. He had always known that reforming a system as deeply ingrained as law enforcement would be a monumental task, but he had underestimated the resistance he would face. It was one thing to imagine change, to see it as an abstract goal, but it was something else entirely to confront the entrenched beliefs of people who saw his reforms as a threat to their way of life. The next morning, as Aaron arrived at the precinct, he was met with a surprise. Outside the building, a group of protesters had gathered, their signs held high as they chanted for justice and accountability. Some of the signs read, "Support Commissioner Evans," while others declared, "Justice for all," and "Police reform now." The sight filled Aaron with a mixture of pride and humility. These were the people he was fighting for, the people who had endured the consequences of a system that had long neglected them. As he walked through the crowd, several people approached him, offering words of encouragement and thanks. "Thank you for standing up for us," a young woman said, her eyes filled with gratitude. "We're with you, Commissioner," an older man added, clasping Aaron's hand firmly. Aaron nodded, his heart swelling with determination. "Thank you. I promise you, we're not stopping here. We're going to make sure this city has the police force it deserves." As he made his way inside, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was more than just a job or a set of policies. This was a movement, a chance to transform the relationship between the police and the people they served. And for the first time, he felt the weight of history on his shoulders, as though he were standing on the precipice of something monumental. Inside the precinct, however, the atmosphere was markedly different. As he passed through the halls, he could feel the wary glances of his colleagues, the whispers that followed him wherever he went. Some officers nodded in acknowledgement, their respect evident, but others turned away, their expressions a mixture of resentment and distrust. In the break room, a small group of officers huddled together, their voices low but unmistakably defiant. "He's putting us all at risk with these changes," one officer muttered. "You think the people out there are going to care if we're following some new sensitivity protocol when they're out to hurt us?" Another officer scoffed, his tone bitter. "He's just pandering. Wants to look like a hero. But it's us on the front lines, not him." Aaron stopped in his tracks, his heart sinking as he listened to their words. He had expected resistance, but hearing it firsthand was a painful reminder of the division that still existed within his ranks. Taking a deep breath, he stepped into the room, his presence immediately silencing the conversation. "Am I interrupting something?" he asked, his tone calm but firm. The officers glanced at each other, discomfort evident on their faces. One of them cleared his throat, averting his gaze. "No, Commissioner," he mumbled, shifting uncomfortably. Aaron met each of their gazes, his expression unyielding. Aaron didn't hesitate. He grabbed his coat and hurried down the hall, his footsteps echoing through the precinct. When he arrived in the briefing room, he found Rachel standing at the head of the table, her arms folded and her expression grim. Around the table sat the precinct captains, each wearing a look that ranged from anger to unease. "What's going on?" Aaron asked, scanning the room. The tension was thick, and he could feel the weight of unspoken words pressing down on him. One of the captains, Matthews, was the first to speak. He had been openly critical of Aaron's reforms from the beginning, and his expression now was one of barely contained frustration. "We've been hearing complaints from the officers," Matthews said, his tone edged with bitterness. "They're saying these reforms are tying their hands, making it impossible to do their jobs effectively. We're losing control of the streets, Commissioner." Aaron's jaw tightened, but he forced himself to remain calm. He knew Matthews represented a faction of the department that was deeply resistant to change, and he had prepared himself for this confrontation. "Losing control?" Aaron echoed. "I think you mean we're enforcing accountability. Our job isn't to control the streets, Captain. It's to serve the people on them." Matthews let out a derisive snort. "With all due respect, Commissioner, you're not the one out there every night, dealing with violent criminals. These policies are making officers hesitant to act, afraid they'll end up under investigation for just doing their jobs. Or maybe, Rachel interjected, her gaze as see, they're finally thinking before they act. Maybe they're considering the consequences of their actions. A murmur rippled through the room, and Aaron took a step forward, his gaze moving from one captain to the next. I understand that change is hard, but we're not here to serve ourselves. We're here for the community. And if we're losing the trust of the people we serve, then we've already lost. Matthew's eyes flashed, his posture rigid. This department was built on tradition, Commissioner. A tradition of strong, decisive action. These new policies undermine that. Aaron held his ground, meeting Matthew's gaze unflinchingly. Tradition doesn't excuse injustice. If we're going to continue to operate as we always have, then we'll continue to breed the same resentment and mistrust. Is that what you want, Captain? Silence filled the room as Aaron's words settled over them, and he could see the conflict playing out on the faces of the captains. Some of them shifted uncomfortably, while others lowered their gazes, unwilling to meet his eyes. Rachel looked at him, a glimmer of admiration in her gaze. Just then, the door opened, and a sergeant entered, his expression tense. "Commissioner Evans, there's something you should see. A protest outside City Hall. It's about the reforms." Aaron nodded, dismissing the captains before he followed the sergeant down to the street level. As he stepped outside, he saw a crowd gathering in front of City Hall, their signs held high as they chanted for justice and accountability. The sight filled him with a surge of pride. But there was also an unmistakable undercurrent of tension in the air. Counter-protesters had gathered as well, holding signs decrying Aaron's reforms, and the two groups were exchanging heated words. Aaron pushed his way through the crowd, his heart pounding as he surveyed the scene. He could see community leaders, local activists, and ordinary citizens who had taken up his cause, standing firm in their support for his reforms. But he also saw police union representatives, off-duty officers, and others who resented what they saw as a betrayal of their way of life. The clash between the two groups was escalating quickly, their voices rising to a fever pitch. Sensing the situation spiraling out of control, Aaron climbed onto a makeshift platform in the center of the crowd, raising his hands for silence. "Please, everyone, listen," he called out, his voice carrying over the noise. Slowly, the crowd quieted, all eyes turning toward him. The anger and frustration etched into their faces was unmistakable, but Aaron met their gazes with a steady calm. "I understand that there are strong feelings on both sides of this issue," he began, his tone firm but empathetic. "But we need to remember why we're here. These reforms aren't meant to punish officers. They're meant to protect the people we serve, to restore trust in our department." A man from the back shouted, "Trust. We can't trust the police if they're not willing to do their jobs." Aaron turned toward the voice, his expression serious. "I hear you. I know these changes feel uncomfortable, even threatening, to some of you, but we can't ignore the reality that some of our actions, our methods, have damaged this community. If we're truly here to protect and serve, then we have to be willing to make sacrifices, to question our methods, and to hold ourselves accountable." The crowd murmured, some nodding in agreement while others looked away, their faces set in defiance. Aaron could feel the divide between them, the invisible chasm that had grown wider with every reform he had put in place. But he wasn't here to back down. A woman stepped forward, her voice steady and calm. "Commissioner, I want to believe in what you're doing, but it's hard. We've been hurt, we've been profiled, and we've been mistreated. How can we be sure that things will really change?" Aaron looked at her, a somber understanding in his gaze. "I can't promise that change will happen overnight. This is a long road, and there will be setbacks. But I'm here, fighting for you, because I believe we can create a police force that you can trust, one that sees you, respects you, and values your lives as much as their own." The woman's eyes softened, and she nodded, stepping back into the crowd. A new sense of resolve settled over the people around her, and Aaron felt a glimmer of hope. But as he looked out over the crowd, He also saw the hardened faces of those who resisted him, who saw his reforms as an attack on their livelihood, their values. One of those faces belonged to Lieutenant Grant, who stood at the edge of the crowd, his arms folded and his expression dark. Aaron met his gaze, and a silent understanding passed between them, a battle that would be fought not with words, but with actions. The next day, Aaron found himself back at City Hall, meeting with Mayor Walsh and a small group of city council members. They had called him in to discuss the growing unrest within the police department and the backlash from the police union. The mayor's office was filled with an air of tense anticipation, each council member glancing nervously at Aaron as he took his seat. "Aaron, thank you for coming," Mayor Walsh began, his tone careful. "We're all aware of the incredible work you've done in pushing these reforms forward, but there's a growing concern that the department is reaching a breaking point. Officers are resigning, the union is threatening a walkout, and the public, well, you saw the protest yesterday." Aaron nodded, his expression calm. "I understand, Mayor. But we can't let fear stop us from doing what's right. The reforms are working. We've already seen a decrease in excessive force complaints, and community trust is beginning to rebuild. Change is hard, but it's necessary." Councilwoman Greer, an older woman with a sharp gaze, leaned forward. "Commissioner, we all support your goals, but these changes are creating a division within the department. If we don't find a way to bring people together, we risk losing control of our police force." Aaron took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "I believe that most of our officers are committed to their duty, but those who resist accountability, who resist treating the public with respect, don't belong in this department. I'm not asking for blind loyalty. I'm asking for a commitment to justice." A tense silence filled the room as the council members exchanged uncertain glances. Aaron knew he was asking them to trust him, to take a leap of faith in a vision that was as uncertain as it was ambitious. Finally, Mayor Walsh spoke, his tone soft but resolute. "I trust you, Aaron. We all do. But let's keep a close eye on this situation. We'll support you, but we can't ignore the risks. This city needs a police force it can rely on." Aaron nodded, a mixture of gratitude and determination in his gaze. "Thank you, Mayor. I won't let you down." As Aaron returned to the precinct that afternoon, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had faced resistance, doubt, and even hostility, but he wasn't about to let any of it deter him. He was fighting not just for his mother, or for the people who had suffered, but for a vision of justice that was bigger than himself, a vision that, he hoped, would outlast him. Inside the precinct, he was met by Rachel, who handed him a file with a look of urgency. "Aaron, you need to see this." He opened the file, his brow furrowing as he read through the report. It detailed an investigation into a recent incident where an officer had used excessive force during a routine traffic stop, a stop eerily similar to what his mother had experienced. Rachel's expression was somber. "The officer involved is one of Grant's closest allies. He's been resisting our reforms since day one. This could be a test, a way to see if you're willing to enforce the new policies against your own." Aaron's jaw clenched, his gaze hardening. "Then we'll show them that we mean business. Schedule a hearing. I want the officer suspended, effective immediately." Rachel nodded, a faint smile of approval on her face. "Understood." As she left, Aaron sat back in his chair, feeling the weight of his decision settle over him. He knew that suspending the officer would only deepen the divide within the department, but he also knew that this was a battle he couldn't afford to lose. If he backed down now, if he compromised on his principles, he would be undermining everything he had worked for. He glanced at the photo of his mother on his desk, her warm smile a reminder of the values she had instilled in him. He could almost hear her voice, urging him to stand firm, to fight for what was right, no matter the cost. In that moment, Aaron Evans knew that he was ready to face whatever came next. The road ahead was long, and the challenges were daunting, but he was undeterred. This fight for justice, for accountability was one he was prepared to see through to the end. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the precinct in shadows, Aaron's resolve burned brighter than ever, a beacon of hope in a city that was just beginning to awaken to the possibility of change. Lines in the sand. The precinct was quieter than usual. News of the officer's suspension had spread like wildfire, creating a charged silence that was almost more unsettling than open resistance. Aaron could feel the weight of each officer's gaze as he walked through the hallways, some watching him with approval, others with barely concealed resentment. His decision to suspend Officer Greer, a veteran with years of service and connections across the department, had sent a clear message: no one was exempt from accountability. In his office, Aaron found Rachel Lynn waiting for him, her expression as grim as the atmosphere outside. She handed him a folder with several new complaints from officers who had expressed concerns about the increasing restrictions, their letters filled with language that bordered on insubordination. He could sense the challenge in their words, a quiet but fierce defiance against his reforms. "Looks like they're drawing lines in the sand," Rachel said, her voice soft but steady. "Some of them are accusing you of targeting officers unfairly, saying you're undermining their ability to enforce the law." Aaron exhaled slowly, setting the file on his desk. "We're not targeting anyone, Rachel. We're enforcing standards that should have been in place all along." She nodded, though her expression remained troubled. "I know, but the resistance is growing. I think it's time to hold a department-wide meeting. Address this head-on. Otherwise, the resentment is only going to build." Aaron nodded in agreement. "You're right. Schedule it for tomorrow. I want everyone there. No exceptions." The following day, the precinct's auditorium was filled to capacity. Every officer, detective, and captain sat in the rows of chairs, their expressions ranging from supportive to openly defiant. Aaron stood at the front of the room, flanked by Rachel and a few senior officers who shared his vision. As he looked out over the crowd, he felt a mixture of determination and weariness. This was a defining moment, one that would either unify them or solidify the division within the department. He cleared his throat, his gaze sweeping over the audience. "Thank you all for being here," he began, his voice carrying through the silence. "I know these past few weeks have been challenging. The reforms we're implementing are not easy changes. They're uncomfortable, disruptive, and in some cases, deeply personal. But they are necessary." A murmur rippled through the crowd, but Aaron continued undeterred. "Our mission, as officers of the law, is to serve and protect. But that mission means nothing if we don't hold ourselves to the highest standards. We are here to safeguard the rights of every citizen, not to wield power without accountability." A voice from the back of the room interrupted him, sharp and confrontational. "And what about protecting ourselves? Commissioner, you're making us hesitate, second-guess every decision. Out on the streets, hesitation can mean life or death." Aaron recognized the speaker, Officer Blake, a younger officer who had been vocal in his opposition to the new policies. He met Blake's gaze, his own expression steady. "Hesitation is one thing," Aaron replied calmly, "but reckless action is another. I'm not asking you to compromise your safety. I'm asking you to consider the impact of your actions. I want each of you to return home safely at the end of your shift, just as I want every civilian to feel safe when they encounter us. This is not a contradiction. It's a standard of respect and responsibility." Blake scoffed, shaking his head. "Respect. Tell that to the criminals we're dealing with. You're not the one out there on the front lines, Commissioner." The tension in the room thickened, and several officers murmured their agreement, their faces tense with frustration and resentment. Aaron felt a flicker of anger but suppressed it, keeping his voice even. "I may not be on every street corner," he said, "but I understand the risks. I understand the sacrifices each of you make. But we cannot allow fear to cloud our judgment. If we fail to treat every person with respect, yes, even those we arrest, we risk losing the trust that we're here to build." Silence followed his words, and for a moment, Aaron wondered if he was getting through to them. But then Lieutenant Grant stood up, his gaze cold and challenging. "Commissioner, with all due respect, these reforms are destroying morale. We've had a dozen officers file for early retirement this month alone, and that number's only going to grow. The officers who remain feel like they're being vilified just for doing their jobs. Maybe it's time to reconsider these policies before you lose the entire department." A ripple of agreement passed through the crowd, and Aaron felt the weight of the challenge pressing down on him. He had expected resistance, but facing it head-on, seeing the hardened expressions of those who had once respected him, was a bitter pill to swallow. Rachel stepped forward, her voice calm but resolute. "These policies aren't about punishing anyone, Lieutenant. They're about accountability. They're about making sure we're upholding the values we claim to serve. If officers are unwilling to meet those standards, then maybe it's time for them to move on." Grant glared at her, his voice dripping with contempt. "Easy for you to say, Lynn. You're not the one risking your life on the streets every day." Aaron clenched his jaw, feeling his patience fray. "Enough," he said, his voice cutting through the tension. He looked directly at Grant, his tone steely. "These changes are here to stay. If anyone in this room feels that they cannot uphold the standards we're setting, then I suggest you think carefully about your place here." A heavy silence filled the room, and Aaron knew his words were a challenge, a line drawn in the sand. He had made it clear that there would be no compromise on integrity, no bending to appease those who resisted accountability. He could see the resentment simmering on some faces, but he also saw glimmers of understanding, a quiet acceptance from those who were willing to adapt. He took a breath, softening his tone as he looked out over the crowd. "I know this isn't easy. I know that change can feel like a threat. But if we're going to build a police force that this city can trust, then we need to be willing to hold ourselves to a higher standard. This isn't just my fight. It's ours. And together, we can be the change that this city deserves." With that, he stepped back, signaling that the meeting was over. The officers filed out in silence, their expressions unreadable. Aaron watched them go, feeling a mix of exhaustion and hope. He knew he had asked a lot of them, and he could only hope that they would rise to the challenge. That evening, Aaron sat in his office, the weight of the day settling heavily on him. He had given everything he had to this cause, but he couldn't ignore the fractures that were forming within the department. For every officer who stood behind him, there were others who saw him as an enemy, a force undermining their authority and tradition. As he reviewed the latest reports, his phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. He opened it, his eyes narrowing as he read the words. "We're watching you, Commissioner. Keep pushing, and you'll regret it." The message was short, chilling in its simplicity. Aaron felt a prickle of unease, but he pushed it aside, refusing to let fear take root. He had faced threats before, threats from criminals, from people who wanted to silence him. But this felt different, more personal, as though someone within his own ranks was warning him to back down. He dialed Rachel's number, his voice low when she answered. "Rachel, I think we may have a problem. I just received a threat." There was a pause on the other end, and he could hear the concern in her voice. "Do you think it's someone from inside the department?" "It's possible," Aaron admitted, his tone grim. "We're making enemies, and I don't think they're all on the outside." Rachel's voice took on a steely edge. "We'll increase your security, Aaron, and I'll start looking into any unusual activity among the officers. If there's someone trying to sabotage this, we'll find them." "Thank you, Rachel," Aaron replied, feeling a wave of gratitude. "But let's keep this quiet for now. I don't want to create more tension." After hanging up, Aaron leaned back in his chair, staring at the message on his phone. He knew that the fight for reform would have consequences, that standing up to a system as deeply rooted as law enforcement would provoke backlash. But he hadn't anticipated just how personal it would become. In the days that followed, the tension within the precinct continued to simmer, an unspoken conflict that manifested in subtle glances, whispered conversations, and a sense of unease that pervaded every corner of the building. Rachel kept her promise, quietly investigating any suspicious activity among the officers, but she was careful not to create a stir. Aaron, meanwhile, kept his focus on the reforms, determined not to let fear or intimidation derail his mission. One afternoon, as he was leaving the precinct, he noticed a group of officers gathered in the parking lot, their voices low but urgent. Among them was Lieutenant Grant, his posture tense as he spoke to the others. Aaron couldn't hear their words, but he could see the hardened expressions on their faces, the way they glanced over at him as though he were an intruder. Ignoring the prickle of unease, Aaron walked over, his footsteps purposeful. The group fell silent as he approached, their expressions guarded. "Everything all right here?" he asked, his tone calm but firm. Grant crossed his arms, his gaze unflinching. "Just discussing the recent changes, Commissioner. Seems like there's a lot of disagreement about the direction you're taking us." Aaron met his gaze, refusing to back down. "Disagreement is one thing, Lieutenant, but undermining the mission of this department is another. If you have concerns, my door is always open." Grant's lips curled into a faint sneer. "We've tried talking, Commissioner, but it seems you're more interested in changing the rules than listening to your own officers." Aaron felt a surge of anger but kept his expression neutral. "These reforms are non-negotiable. If anyone has a problem with that, they're welcome to explore other opportunities." The tension between them crackled like electricity, but Grant held his gaze for a moment longer before turning away, his expression hard. As the officers dispersed, Aaron stood alone in the parking lot, his heart pounding with a mixture of frustration and resolve. He knew that he had just drawn a line in the sand, a boundary that would either solidify his authority or deepen the rift within the department. But he couldn't afford to waver. The stakes were too high, and he had come too far to back down now. Later that night, as he returned home, Aaron found himself reflecting on the sacrifices he had made, the countless hours spent fighting a system that seemed determined to resist change at every turn. He had lost friends, faced threats, and risked his own career, all for a vision of justice that felt, at times, like a distant dream. But as he looked out over the city, the lights stretching out into the horizon, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. This fight was more than a job. It was a calling, a mission to create a world where every person, every mother, father, and child, could walk the streets without fear. In the quiet of his home, he took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle over him. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with danger and opposition. But he was ready. For his mother, for the people who had suffered in silence, and for the future he believed in, he would stand firm. And as the night deepened, Aaron Evans knew that he was prepared to face whatever came next. The battle lines had been drawn, and there was no turning back. The unseen threat. Aaron Evans awoke before dawn, his thoughts swirling as he prepared for what was bound to be another challenging day. The threat he'd received, the rising tension among the officers, and the silent resistance from factions within his department weighed heavily on him. Despite the mounting obstacles, he reminded himself why he had chosen this fight. Change was never easy, and he had accepted that this journey would be grueling. But he hadn't anticipated just how personal and treacherous the battle would become. As he left his house that morning, he noticed something unusual. A black sedan was parked just a little too far down the street, its windows tinted, engine running quietly. He didn't recognize the car, but he felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He was used to seeing the occasional unmarked vehicle, when Rachel's team discreetly checked in on him after the recent threats. But this felt different. This car hadn't been there the night before. He brushed off the unease as best he could, getting into his own vehicle and heading to the precinct. But the lingering feeling of being watched stayed with him, casting a shadow over his morning. When he arrived at the precinct, Rachel was waiting for him, her face tense. "Morning," Aaron greeted her, forcing a smile. "What's the latest?" Rachel didn't smile back. "We need to talk. In private." Aaron's stomach dropped. He followed her into his office, closing the door behind them. Rachel took a deep breath, her eyes searching his face before she spoke. "I've been digging into Officer Greer's connections, as well as some of the complaints coming in about your reforms," she began, lowering her voice. "And I found something disturbing. There's a faction within the department, an organized group of officers who are actively resisting your reforms. They're calling themselves the Guardians." Aaron's jaw clenched. The Guardians? Who's leading them? Rachel hesitated, her gaze shifting away. "Lieutenant Grant." Aaron exhaled sharply, his hands curling into fists. He had suspected Grant of being a thorn in his side, but he hadn't imagined this level of defiance. "How large is this group?" he asked, his voice steady but laced with anger. "It's hard to say," Rachel admitted, "but it's not a handful. I've tracked encrypted communications between members, and it's clear they're more than just a group of disgruntled officers. They're organized, and they're determined to undermine everything you're doing." Aaron felt a flicker of both fear and anger. The Guardians were more than a faction. They were a calculated threat, officers who had sworn to uphold the law, but had turned against it to protect a culture of impunity. "What are they planning?" he asked, his voice low. Rachel shook her head, frustration evident. "They're careful. They'd been hiding their tracks, using burner phones, encrypted messages. But from what I've gathered, they're escalating. There's talk of taking you out of the picture, whatever that means." The words hung heavily in the air, a chilling reminder of the unseen dangers that lurked within his own department. Aaron leaned back, his mind racing. "We need to find a way to dismantle this group before they do real harm. If they're willing to go to these lengths, there's no telling what they're capable of." Rachel nodded. "I'll keep digging, but we need to be cautious. If they catch wind that we're onto them, they could retaliate." Aaron clenched his jaw, anger boiling beneath his calm exterior. "Let them know we're watching. I won't be intimidated by a group of officers who believe they're above accountability. We'll bring them down, piece by piece, if we have to." Rachel met his gaze, a flicker of admiration in her eyes. "I'll double security around your house, Aaron. And I'll alert the Internal Affairs Unit. They need to start an official investigation." Aaron nodded, his mind already formulating a plan. He would take this one step at a time, rooting out the Guardians and dismantling their influence. But he couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that this battle would come at a cost. Over the next few weeks, the situation escalated. Aaron received anonymous threats almost daily, emails, phone calls, even notes slipped under his office door. Each message carried the same chilling warning: "Step down, or you'll regret it." The Guardians became bolder, their actions more direct. Some officers deliberately disregarded his directives in front of other colleagues, openly mocking the new protocols he had implemented. Rumors circulated that certain precinct captains were sympathetic to the Guardians, turning a blind eye to their insubordination. Aaron could see the poisonous effect spreading through the department, a division that deepened with each day. One evening, as Aaron was leaving the precinct, he found his car's tires slashed. He stood in the dim parking lot, staring at the vandalism, a mixture of anger and frustration churning within him. He knew this was the work of the Guardians, a petty, cowardly act meant to rattle them. He took out his phone and called Rachel. "They're getting desperate," he said, his voice taut with barely contained rage. "Desperate and dangerous," she replied. "Aaron, maybe it's time to consider a more proactive approach. If we can't get Internal Affairs to act quickly, we might need to bring in an external investigative team, someone outside the department." Aaron considered her words carefully. Bringing in an external team would be a drastic step, one that could potentially expose the department to public scrutiny. But as he looked at his slashed tires, he knew Rachel was right. This wasn't just a faction of disgruntled officers. It was a conspiracy to undermine his authority and the integrity of the department. "Do it," he said finally. "Bring in whoever you need. I don't care about the consequences." Rachel nodded, her voice filled with determination. "I'll make the arrangements. Hang tight, Aaron. We're not letting them win. A week later, the external investigation began in full force. Investigators from an independent oversight committee arrived at the precinct, reviewing personnel files, interviewing officers, and scrutinizing every aspect of the department's operations. The presence of the committee sent shockwaves through the department, further dividing those who supported Aaron's reforms and those who resented them. Aaron received mixed reactions. Some officers thanked him for taking a stand, expressing relief that someone was finally holding their colleagues accountable. Others glared at him with barely concealed hostility, their resentment palpable. In the midst of the investigation, Aaron found himself the target of a smear campaign. False allegations surfaced, accusations of misusing funds, favoritism, even suggestions that he had falsified records to promote his agenda. Local news outlets picked up the story, casting him as a power-hungry commissioner willing to trample over his officers to make a name for himself. One evening, as he sat alone in his office, he received a call from Mayor Walsh. The mayor's tone was cautious, almost regretful. "Aaron, I've been getting calls from council members, influential people in the city," he began. "They're worried that this investigation is tearing the department apart. They're saying you've lost control." Aaron felt a surge of frustration, but he kept his tone calm. "Mayor, this isn't about control. It's about integrity. The Guardians have created a toxic culture in this department, and if we don't address it now, it will only get worse." Mayor Walsh sighed. "I know you're doing what you believe is right, but public perception matters, Aaron. If the people start to lose confidence in you, it could jeopardize everything you've worked for." Aaron clenched his jaw, anger simmering beneath his calm exterior. "If I back down now, we're sending a message that corruption and defiance are acceptable. I won't do that, Mayor." There was a long pause, and when the mayor spoke again, his tone was resigned. "All right, Aaron. I trust you. But be careful. The city's watching." As the call ended, Aaron sat back in his chair, his mind heavy with the weight of his mission. He knew that his decision to stand firm had put him at odds with powerful forces within and outside the department. But he was determined to see this through, no matter the cost. One cold November night, as Aaron returned home from a long day at the precinct, he found a package on his doorstep. It was wrapped in plain brown paper, with no return address. He felt a prickle of unease as he picked it up, his instincts warning him that something was wrong. He took the package inside, setting it on the kitchen counter. As he unwrapped it, he found a framed photograph inside, a picture of his mother. The glass was shattered, her face obscured by cracks that spidered across the frame. Aaron's heart dropped, a wave of fear washing over him. This was no ordinary threat. It was personal, a warning that the Guardians knew exactly how to hurt him. He called Rachel immediately, his voice trembling with anger and fear. "They're going after my family, Rachel. They left a picture of my mother on my doorstep, shattered." Rachel's voice was steady but filled with concern. "We'll increase security around her home, Aaron, and we'll monitor any suspicious activity near your place. They're trying to intimidate you, to make you back down." Aaron gripped the phone tightly, his voice low. "I won't let them scare me, Rachel, but I'm not putting my mother at risk. She's been through enough." The threat had shaken him, but it had also steeled his resolve. The Guardians were becoming increasingly desperate, their tactics more ruthless. He knew that the investigation was closing in on them, that they were losing their grip on the department. But he also knew that their desperation made them more dangerous than ever. Days turned into weeks, and the investigation continued to expose the Guardians' network of influence. Several officers were suspended, pending further review, and Lieutenant Grant was placed on administrative leave. The Guardians had lost some of their key players, but Aaron knew that the battle was far from over. One evening, as he prepared to leave the precinct, he received a call from Rachel. Her voice was tense, filled with urgency. "Aaron, we've received credible information that the Guardians are planning something big. We don't know the details yet, but it's clear they're not going down without a fight." Aaron felt a chill run down his spine. "What do you need me to do?" Rachel's voice was calm but resolute. "We're setting up surveillance around the precinct and your home. But I need you to be vigilant. This isn't just about protecting your reforms anymore, Aaron. It's about your safety." Aaron nodded, his mind racing. "Understood. Let's tighten security across the board. We can't afford to underestimate them." As he left the precinct, he couldn't shake the feeling that something ominous was looming, a threat that went beyond the Guardians' previous tactics. He drove home, his eyes scanning the shadows, every car and pedestrian taking on an air of suspicion. When he arrived at his house, he found his mother waiting for him, a warm smile on her face. She had insisted on coming to stay with him, her presence a reminder of the values he was fighting for. "You look tired," she said softly, reaching out to touch his cheek. "You've been fighting so hard." Aaron managed a smile, his voice weary but filled with conviction. "It's worth it, Mom. We're making a difference, but it's getting dangerous. They're not backing down." She nodded, her gaze filled with quiet strength. "I know, but you've never been one to back down from a fight, Aaron. You were born to do this." As they sat together in the quiet of his home, Aaron felt a sense of calm settle over him, a resolve that strengthened with each passing moment. The Guardians could threaten him, intimidate him, even endanger his family. But they couldn't break him. He was prepared to face whatever came next, to stand firm in the face of fear and defiance. This fight wasn't just about reform. It was about the soul of the department, the future of his city. And as the night deepened, Aaron Evans knew that he was ready. The Guardians could throw everything they had at him, but he would not falter. For his mother, for the city, and for every person who believed in justice, he would see this fight through to the end. The real battle was only beginning, and he was prepared to face it, no matter the cost.